No, I think it's okay. Okay, so what I want to talk about was the Akedah, and as professionally, I deal with medical ethics. I teach medical ethics, and my doctorate's in medical history and medical ethics. So, one of the many questions about the Akedah has to do with the ethical tension within that story. And the main, I think that the way that most of the modern Western world is familiar with it is through Kierkegaard's famous book, Fear and Trembling, which is more or less a monograph that he wrote. He was a young man. I think he only died, I think he was about 45 when he died. He wrote this as a young man. And Kierkegaard was really the founder of a new type of philosophy, existential philosophy. He was really the first person who started looking at ethical questions as kind of this inner struggle, as opposed to a struggle between competing, I would call it, claims on a person. And I'll talk about that a little bit. And anyway, because we're all familiar with the Akedah, I don't have to go through the story itself, but more or less the general view, and this is the general way that Kierkegaard understands, or Kierkegaard is understood as presenting the ethical problem in the Akedah, is very simple. On the one hand, you have ethics, which is also in the mid-1800s, the main understanding of what ethical behavior was a universal, and this came from Kant, who had written 100 years beforehand, and had really changed the way the world viewed what an ethical act was. And if people remember from high school or from college philosophy, I remember he had this idea of a universal or categorical imperative, which is something which is true in each and every instance, and only when you can find something which is always true in each and every instance can you find something which could be labeled as moral or as ethical. And Kant's viewpoint really swept throughout the entire Western philosophical world very quickly, and that became the way of thinking about what doing something moral or immoral meant, whether I'm going against this universal claim of morality or I'm working within that universal framework. So in more or less the general approach in Yiddishkeit has been to look at this kind of struggle. All right? So on the one hand you have, let me just to restate it, make it a little bit sharper. On the one hand you have this universal claim, and on the other hand you have this very particularistic command coming to sacrifice or to bring up your child as a sacrifice. Right? So you have something universally, of course, it's not something that we would say is moral, but on the other hand you have a particularistic instance of somebody being told to do something, and he's being told by Hakadosh Baruch Hu himself. Right? So that's the tension, that's the way the story is generally understood as it's presented by Kierkegaard. Right?
But in that world, everyone did bring human sacrifices. It's only in our civilization we look at it differently.
Now, it might be true. We don't see at that point in the story, we don't see that that's going on. We see it later on when we're talking about the Knanim, what they're doing with the Molech and this and that. But at least what we know in Bereshit up to that point, we don't see this going on. It might be true, it might not be true when Avram Avinu was around. But it's not the framework of the story. Is not framed as, I remember, one of the lessons they taught me in Cheder was to say, well, this shows against human sacrifice. This was part of the story. It's not framed that way at all. There's nothing, I don't think there's anything to do with that. We could say that. Archaeologists might say that.
You're saying even in his world it might have been an unusual act?
Yeah, it could be a very unusual act. So at any rate, in general, the Jewish view of this tension was that, look, on the one hand, you have HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and on the other hand, you have universally accepted ethical command, and even Rav Sada Gaon talks about mitzvot sichliot, but he calls against shimiot, which are the mitzvot sechliot, which are intellectual mitzvot, like lo tirtzah, which people would have come to on their own. It's universal morality that every culture has the same type of understanding that, in most circumstances, we don't just go out and kill somebody. There's something the matter with that. And on the other hand, there's talks about mitzvot, mitzvot shemiot, which are particular Jewish commands which you couldn't have come up with yourself.
So morality in this sense, the Kant or whoever, it's very subjective. It's how they understand it and define it. And the universal morality not killing somebody is very functional. Society would break down. So why is that moral? Why is that right or wrong? It's very functional. If you had another function where it wasn't society's interest to go out and kill a whole neighborhood, so you do it.
Well, but
that's the finish of the Torah, I think.
It could be. Well, I'm going to discuss this in a second. Kierkegaard also, he discusses this when he contrasts Avraham Avinu to a different type of a person who he calls a tragic hero. And I'll get to that in a second.
How would you deal with commands to murder the 7 nations from God? I mean,
We'll get to that. We'll get to that also. Kierkegaard. I'm not going to talk about that halakhically right now, but Kierkegaard does mention it again. He makes a differentiation between what he calls a tragic hero and Avraham Avinu, who he calls a knight of faith. We'll get to that in a second.
Called what?
A knight of faith. A knight of faith. And now where was it? So in Yiddishkeit, generally the approach has been to say that, look, God's mitzvot and rationality, or let's say, or rational morality, are two separate things, but they're equivalent. So that means that God would not command something, because God, especially in terms of the way the Rambam presents things, because God is rationality itself, God would not command us something which is not rational, and they're equivalent. Philosophically, we would say that they are equivalent. Christians have taken another path in Christian theology, and it makes sense if you think about what Christian mythology is about. It says, not that they're two separate items, morality and God's will, or whatever God is telling us, but rather that because God commands us something, that makes it moral. Right? So they see, rather than being equivalent, they see them as being identical.
That also
that's Jew.
No. If it's a Jewish, and again, we could go through lots and lots of sources, and there are few and far between sources that would say anything that God commands us is, because it's a command of God, ipso facto moral. Rather, they would say, and this has been the stance, like I said, from the Rasag, I think, Rasag Yagon, the first person who came up, it's in Midrashim also, right? They say, we would learn sniut from a cat. We would learn, this one, that there's an idea of innate morality that doesn't necessarily come from being commanded by God. And there's a question, so why does God have to command it? It could be that to give you more schar, that once lo tirtzach, you're not going to go do it anyway, most people, but once you have a commandment of lo tirtzach, so then by not killing, so you get a schar mitzvah, right? That it becomes something else. But there's not, and again, philosophically there's a difference between equivalence and identification, right? Identity means that I am myself. I can't separate myself from one. I'm one and the same thing. I occupy the same, again, philosophically, the same space and time. Okay, that's identical things. But equivalent things would be this chair and another chair. They're equivalent. It doesn't matter which one.
Is there a clash of moral values? If someone comes to kill you, the Torah says kill him first.
Okay, exactly. So that again, we're going to get back to this, and this is what Kierkegaard, again, he talks about as this is a moral choice of somebody who becomes, in his eyes, a tragic hero. For the most, and I'm just giving a little bit more background history. So, just as kind of as a footnote, most of the theological discussions, also in the Christian world, philosophical world, about the Akedah were not about the ethics per se for many, many years, but rather, right, because we have 2,000 years of history going on before Kierkegaard starts talking about this. But most of them were actually about the theological question of God's omniscience. Right? How could it be a test of Abraham if he knows already what's going to happen? And that was the main question that people dealt with in talking about the Akedah, and they didn't see this other one as problematic. It might be because of this reason, especially in the Christian world, that whatever God says to do, right, makes it moral because God said it. So there's no maflokim. It's like they caught David Frost caught Nixon. He trapped him kind of into saying, well, whatever the president says is right because the president said it. Okay, so at any rate,
maybe because in Christianity, death is salvation.
Right.
In other words, dying God is
right.
For salvation. So they see death in a different context.
Right, they definitely see death in a different context. That's definitely true. But at any rate, to get back to the moral question here, the ethical struggle here, if we have on the one hand, and again, this is the way it's generally been understood, on the other hand, we have this universal commandment of not killing, or especially not killing your own flesh and blood, on the one hand, and then we have this particularistic command that God tells a particular person, and this is the same claim, that crazy people have said throughout the ages. Well, God told me